Hey, Crosspark, this is the longer video that I promised Sunday morning to talk about some issues in Romans and in Romans 1 particularly. I mentioned that I'm not a good enough preacher to spend 16 years or even much shorter than that in Romans. We're going to move through large chunks of the text, which means that, of course, we can't cover everything. I mean, that's true of any text, actually. So because the Bible's the Word of God, in some sense, you could never say anything. You couldn't get to all of the implications and applications from any text because God could use it in substantial ways in different people's lives and it's in endless ways. However, there are also texts that are more dense than others. And Romans is one of those texts that tends to be particularly dense. You could spend lots of time on short phrases, a sentence or two, and we're going large chunks, half a chapter at a time. And I don't think that's inappropriate. Obviously, there's pros and cons and trade-offs, but we have chosen to do it this way for a couple of reasons. One, I actually think that given how, now this is a longer letter than most from the ancient world, but people would have heard these letters all at once and probably many times in large chunks. I'm not saying, I don't know in great detail how the early church also would have talked about and gone through it. They probably would have gone at different paces through it. But there is value in thinking in big chunks to put the pieces together. The other thing is, and I was convinced of this by Tim Keller several years ago, given the world we live in, a relatively mobile society, people move around a lot. If we spent all of our time in any passage, no matter Romans, Isaiah, Genesis, whatever it is, you could spend really valuable time, and of course it's all profitable, but over the course of 4 or 5 years with us, people would get very little variety. And we do want to proclaim the whole counsel of God, meaning we want to cover a wide variety of what's in the text. And there's all different kinds of genres, different kinds of approaches, different kinds of angles, and we think they're all helpful. So we try self-consciously to go back and forth, Old Testament, New Testament, narrative, letters, poetry, prophecy, right? We're trying to hit all the different kinds of things. So, all right, with all that apologetic there, I wanted to cover a few things we weren't able to get to very well Sunday morning. First, I did some deep diving on Paul's name last week. In the Bible, it's often really fascinating how at a key moment, God changes people's names, or sometimes people's names are or are not said in important ways at key moments in a story. And so we have Saul, who was also called Paul, and I was trying to figure out what's exactly the deal there. So Paul would have had 4 names, we believe. He would have had Saul, which was his Hebrew name, and he would have had a 3-name Roman name. So perhaps some of you are familiar with how the Roman world worked. Perhaps some of you have seen movies like Gladiator, where a gladiator proclaims himself Maximus Decimus Meridius, right? The 3 names. So Paulos would have been the 3rd name in Paul's name. So we don't know his first name, we don't know his family name, but we know this final name, Paulos. And interestingly, the word Paulos in Greek would have meant, or Latin would have meant small. Maybe he was born small. But people think maybe he was short. We don't know. But he's Saul, who is also known as Paul. So officially, this was not a name change. This was, he used both names. But you do see something interesting going on in his story. In the book of Acts, when Luke is retelling what happened in the early church, you see that although he had been called Saul, because that was his Hebrew name, and as a Pharisee, right, he was identifying himself with his Hebrew background, and what was really important to him is the Hebrew theology. After his conversion and after he begins going to the Gentiles, Luke exclusively calls him Paul. And in his letters, Paul identifies himself as Paul and not Saul. And so, although it is not technically a name change, it seems to me that there's something significant to it, sort of literarily and symbolically, that Paul had seen himself as a Pharisee of Pharisees. He was, committed to strictly and stringently interpreting the Old Testament and the oral traditions. But when he saw the light, literally in his case, when he became a Christian and heard the gospel and became converted and was a follower of Jesus, not only was he a different person, but he also got this new calling. And his calling was to be an apostle to the Gentiles. And so in the Pauline mode from 1 Corinthians 9 of being all things to all people, Paul went by his Roman name, his Gentile name, to identify himself with the particular calling that God put on his life. And so you're going to see, and we're going to talk more in a minute, there's all this back and forth sort of Jewish Gentile stuff that relates to Paul and his story. So actually, let's talk about that. It can be a little confusing at times. Why is the gospel for the Jews first and then the Gentiles? What does that mean? I did mention this briefly in the sermon. But God worked in and through the Hebrew people. It was very significant. And he chose to do so not because they were so awesome. In fact, because they weren't, right? Because they were small. They were insignificant. They ended up being slaves, right, in Egypt. And they were a marginalized, mistreated people at many times in their story. And God chose the weak things to shame the strong and the foolish things to shame the wise, Paul says in 1 Corinthians 1. God did this to show something of his power, that he didn't need to pick the most powerful people to sort of make him look good. In fact, he could pick the weakest people because his power is sufficient and works in and through weakness. And so you see that theme, which is going to be important in Romans. You see that theme working itself out in redemptive history as God works through the Israelites. So the plan, it's interesting, there's a plan for a universal redemption, right? For all tribes, tongues, and nations, for everyone who believes. But it starts particularly with a small group of people, the Israelites. And God plans all along, right? He's working towards this fullness. So he makes promises and he gives patterns. And he does all these things in the lives of the Israelites in their story to get us ready for Jesus. You know, even from the very beginning, the fall in the garden, we were always asking this question: who is going to be, from Genesis 3:15, who's going to be the seed of the woman? Who's going to be the one who comes along and changes everything? Who makes redemption possible? And in one sense, you're always asking this question: is it Abraham? Is it Moses? Is it David? The answer is always no. It's none of them are sufficient. Even the best characters, like in some ways Abraham's a fantastic character, but when you read his story, it's very obvious he's also an incredibly flawed and sinful character. He's not fully up to the task. He believes God and it's credited to him as righteousness, which we'll cover in Romans, but he's not the Redeemer. He's not the Savior. And so Jesus is coming, and these promises are made. You need a king, you need a Messiah, you need a Redeemer, but the ones you've got, the options you have right now, are not good enough. And so when Paul comes on the scene, his strategy, he goes oftentimes in these cities that he goes to plant churches, he goes to the synagogue first. And he does this because they already have the scriptures, the Old Testament and scriptures. He firmly and truly believes, as we do as well, that the Old Testament points strongly to Jesus. It's preparatory for the gospel. And so he goes to the synagogues, he speaks from the Old Testament. The New Testament hadn't been written yet, right? But when Paul is doing ministry, and I mean, he's written some letters and there's a few other things written, but it's not all, there's no New Testament corpus that's been put together. And so he's speaking from the Old Testament and trying to show how Jesus is the fulfillment of the Old Testament. Now, what's interesting is oftentimes he goes there because they have heard the Old Testament and they might listen. Also, it was very common in Jewish synagogues of their day to have what were called God-fearers, which were Gentiles who were really interested in Judaism, interested in the God of Israel. They had not yet become fully Jewish, and yet they were there and they were listening. So in some cases, what happened is Paul would speak at the synagogue, and the God-fearers, the Gentiles who were listening to the Old Testament, were so fascinated by what Paul had to say that they would want to know more, and that it was often through the God-fearers, through the Gentiles, that Paul would then be able to plant a church, a Christian church, among the population. In some cases, mixed Jewish and Gentile. In some cases, it would end up being largely Gentile, because the Jews in that city may have rejected what he had to say about the Old Testament, but the Gentiles who were listening would hear it. So you've got Paul's strategy. He's going to the Jews first. You've got the history. They had the promises. They had the Old Testament. It was given to them. And again, Paul says in Romans 9, what advantage has the Jew? Great in every way. They've heard, in theory, their whole lives about the promises that are now true in Jesus. But then on top of those two things, there's a specialness to the fact that they were God's chosen people. They were chosen by him to work through. And there's something important and special about that. Christians have actually debated a bit about what that means over time, because we see in the Bible, there's both continuity and discontinuity between the Old and New Testament, right? Everything is not the same because Jesus is a planned for advance on the Old Testament. The Old Testament has patterns and promises that are meant to come to fullness in Jesus. So there's, of course, going to be some discontinuity. It's not all the same because Jesus is new. He's a fulfillment. So it's not total discontinuity, right? Yeah, it's the same God. People are the same. Ultimately, salvation is by grace. So there's a lot of continuity. But what's different is that Jesus has come and he's better than the sacrificial system, for example. Okay, so in light of this, Christians have struggled to know, well, what do we make about the Jewish people particularly? And although that's not the point of this video exactly, I do think what's pretty clear is that Paul and Peter love to use Old Testament people of God language for the New Testament church. And Paul says in Romans that those, and in Galatians, in some sense, Jesus is Abraham's heir. In another sense, everyone who believes is Abraham's heir. And so Abraham's heirs are not simply the biological, ethnic children of Abraham. That from a spiritual perspective, the offspring of Abraham are those who believe. And so there is a sense in which God has always been planning to make one people of God, Jewish and Gentile. And we're going to see in Romans, there's all this tension. We see a lot of these New Testament letters because of how things have gone down. There's tension. And so part of what Paul is trying to do in the book of Romans is speak the gospel, speak it to both parties, speak it in a way that can help them understand what's most important and unite around those things. So we don't think there's some separate sort of track for the Jewish people. The fact that they were promised things is important. It's beautiful. Those promises all come to pass in Jesus. And so still, even for people who are ethnically, religiously Jewish historically, their hope is still in Jesus, and they still need to come and find the fullness of God's grace in him. Okay, one other angle to think about, and we talked about this briefly in the sermon, is that Rome is a classic example of the city of man. And so we're going to see Roman values clashing with Christian values. And a lot of times, right, we can use the same words and mean very different things. So I could say my favorite color is blue, but you and I might have very different shades in mind for which blue I mean. I could say the most important thing in my life is love. And it could be that our definitions not only diverge, but are different enough to even be contradictory in some places, right? So ultimately, one of my professors used to say we do theology at a concept level, not simply a word level. And that's important for Romans because you're going to see concepts, words thrown about, and what a Roman would understand them to mean in their cultural context and what Paul means as a Christian, they might be very different things. Now, let me just make one other caveat. People are made in the image of God. Because of that, we are all sinful, and we also all are made for dignity and glory, and we all have some shared sense of truth, beauty, and goodness. And yet, although in some ways we all can recognize commonalities, we can find similar things to be true or good or beautiful, there's also a sense in which both our sin, especially, and our culture can twist and change and pervert and shift the meanings enough to make them really different than what we would say God would think was true or beauty or good. So when we come to Roman culture, there are three words that I picked that show up a fair amount in the New Testament, and particularly in Romans, that would have had a different content for Roman citizens. So, power, glory, and honor are three concepts, that words that would have been very important to Romans. And yet what they would have meant by them and what Paul and what the gospel means by them is going to be very different. So let's think for just a minute about power. We don't have time to do a word study on all of these. The word power, again, depending on your exact English translation, shows up about 10 times in the book of Romans. And power is not just about strength, right? For the Romans, power by definition is, the opposite of weakness. And so you've got power or you don't have power. You're strong or you're weak. And so power, right, was seen in how the Roman legions crushed their enemies. Power was seen in how slaves and many women and children had very few, if any, rights, that people could be mistreated. If someone had the power, then the other person with no power had no way of fighting back or disagreeing or putting up a fight, right? They couldn't say no to whatever the powerful person wanted them to do, or to do with them, or to do to them. And so this sense of power was very important to Rome. They were trying to hold on to their power. They were trying to preserve their power. They wanted stability, and they understood that the best way to have stability in their world was to exert as much power as possible. Well, why does this matter? I said Sunday that the notion of a crucified God was strange, abhorrent to Romans. That sounds like a terrible God. This sounds like a weak God. This sounds like a miserable God. Who would want to worship such a God? And this is the beauty of the gospel, is that the kind of power that God brings to bear in Jesus is different. It just is. It's different. And it is counterintuitive. It is challenging for us to understand. I think in some ways, certainly if you've grown up in the church, but even just growing up in the West, in a place that has been influenced by Christian values, it's difficult for us to understand how in the world, there's some logic to weakness is a path to strength. That does not make any sense to the Romans. That seems simply like nonsense to them. They're opposites. Power and weakness are opposites. They can't have any overlap. And yet it's Paul who tells us that weakness is the way, that when we are weak, then we're strong, because God's power has to show up. We saw that a moment ago, right? He chose a weak people to shame those who were strong so that his power shows up. So God obviously has much more power than anyone else. And oftentimes the power that God exerts is the power of the word. God can do anything he wants, but he speaks. He's a speaking God. So he spoke all things into existence. He upholds all things by the word of his power. And then his lead foot in the climax of his work is someone called the Word of God, who, by the way, becomes weak and puts himself under the powers to be, the powers of the world, and lets them destroy him, so that in his weakness he shows true strength and overcomes them by the resurrection. And now he's offering a different kind of power. So when we look at the power of God in Romans, we've got to think a little bit about how a Roman would have heard that. It's just bare power. It's not necessarily paired with goodness. It's just power, right? Might makes right. For Jesus, we've got a very different kind of thing. Jesus is going to be right, and he'll go weak. He will not use his might in order to show how right he is. So we're going to have to think about honor and glory and power in these words, and we have to make sure that we're giving them some Christian content as we go along. 2 more comments, and then we're done. But I told you this was a longer video. I did want to note that in the beginning of Romans 1, he says he's been longing to preach the gospel to you who are in Rome. Now think about that. Who's he writing to, particularly? He's writing to the church in Rome. He's writing to Christians. He's wanting to come and preach the gospel to the Christians. Now, I don't think that means in an exclusive way that he does not want to preach the gospel to non-Christians. Of course not. But Paul understands the gospel is everything. That the gospel is not just, the A and the Z. It's not just the beginning and the end, it's everything in between. It's not just the basics, it's not the ABCs, it's the A to the Z, right? It's the whole thing. As we said from Galatians 3, you begin the Christian life by grace through faith, and you live the Christian life by grace through faith. Now, in the book of Romans, the word faith often is primarily or in a focused way used about our initial belief, resting, receiving, trusting, believing, right? Our initial belief in the work of Jesus on our behalf to give us a new status before God. So we're resting and receiving, we're trusting and believing that the work of Jesus, the accomplishment of Jesus, the resume of Jesus is what I need. My own work, accomplishment, and resume are no good. So we exchange them. We get rid of mine. Mine is actually a bad resume. I give it to Jesus, and he gives me his resume. And by that, I am declared righteous. And by that righteousness, I have life. Now, what's fascinating is Paul is focused there in many passages. And even here, he sees that all of life is lived by the gospel. All of life is lived by grace through faith. So he says, I'm going to preach the gospel to you who are in Rome. I think that's inclusive enough to certainly include people who haven't read the letter and haven't become Christians yet, but he clearly means the church needs to keep hearing the gospel all the time. We need to preach the gospel to ourselves, we sometimes say. We need to hear the gospel over and over and over and over again. And what's interesting is, in Romans 1, in this first section, you've got this phrase that we talked about for a while, Sunday, the obedience of faith, right? That the kind of obedience we're talking about is the kind that only comes from true faith. And the kind of faith we're talking about is the kind that generates the right kind of obedience. So we're not, so justification and sanctification are distinct things, and yet they also are properly held together in the gospel. Meaning, you don't simply say, well, I'm justified, now it doesn't matter what I do, nor do you sort of say, well, I'm being justified by faith and grace, but now I'm being sanctified by my works. Nor do we say, justification, sanctification are totally the same thing, right? We understand that they are distinct in the sense that I have to become a Christian and be given a new status before I can grow and change, and that growing and changing without a new heart isn't going to justify me, okay, right? So there's all these nuances and tensions we want to hold. And obedience of faith is a great phrase for that. It's very helpful for us if our tendency is at all to get that confused and to either be overly, I've got to work hard and prove, earn my salvation in some way, or if we tend towards what might be called the easy believism, well, I just believed and therefore it doesn't matter what I do and I can live any way I want, that either of those extremes would miss the tension of the obedience of faith. Obedience is produced by faith. A certain kind of faith always produces obedience. So Paul wants us to hold those things together. So think about that as we go through Romans, because we're oftentimes going to be focused on, properly, as Paul is, on some of these issues of justification, the righteousness of God to give you a new status. That's much of the focus of the first 4 chapters. But let's not miss that justifying faith is also a sanctifying faith that leads to obedience. Okay, the last thing I want to say as I wrap up here is that in the show notes, so to speak, in your email, I've got some resources for you to check out if you want some more background. So I've got the Gospel Coalition has a number of resources on Romans. You can see different courses, different things you could click on, listen to, read if you wanted some more background, if you want to follow along and sort of study Romans on your own. Secondly, the Bible Project, I've got their page listed here that sort of is their overview of Romans. So there's text, but there are also some videos, and there's a video on this page it's an overview of Romans 1 through 4 particularly. In the Bible Project, one of the things they're good at is these overview videos, so feel free to check that out. If you want to know a little bit more about Rome, the setting that the early Christians were in, I've got a couple things for you to think about. There's a popular historian out there right now that I listen to and read some. His name's Tom Holland. He's not Spider-Man, that's a different Tom Holland. He's a fascinating character, and he's making a compelling case of how Christianity really changed the world. And I don't think he is personally a believer in Jesus Christ, though he seems very interested. Anyways, I've got a few things for you here. I've got 2 books for you to check out that are going to be in your notes here. One is called Pax, about the Pax Romana, this period of peace, the Golden Age of Rome, which in some ways was the Golden Age, in some ways not at all, as I mentioned, given slaves and people being mistreated and so forth. I'm actually reading that book right now. The second one is Dominion. It's a really well-reviewed book, and it's sort of about how the Christian story changed the world. So it's a broader book. So the first one's more about Rome. The second one's more about Christianity. And then finally, I have I think I have 2 podcasts for you to check out. One is Russell Moore interviewing Tom Holland about the Roman world, and particularly about how crucifixion would have been understood in that world. And then finally, I have a guy, I just ran across this recently. I think the name of this is The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. That's the name of the podcast. And the podcast guy interviews Tom Holland and does a really interesting job of connecting different pieces that will help you understand how Christianity engages even both the Roman world and our modern world. So all that said, click on any of those links if you want to. I think they might be helpful to you. Thank you so much for your time. I hope this was productive and will give you some more background that will help us as we look to understand the gospel in the book of Romans. Thanks, Cross Park. See you Sunday.